Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone whenever you're listening. With me today is British fantasy author Frances Hardinge. Frances, an honor and a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Yes, Frances Hardinge is best-selling author of books such as Cuckoo Song, The Light Tree, Deep Light, and many, many others. Um, so without further, and I must say, one of my favorite authors of all time. So without further ado, uh, let's begin. So, Frances, when did you know that you wanted to become a writer, if there was ever such a defining moment or decision?
I can't actually remember a time when I didn't want to be a writer. Of course, when I was very small, I also wanted to be an artist and an international spy and master unaided flight and learn the language of cats. I have not managed all of these, sadly. Um, I do remember when I was quite young hearing about this book called The Young Visitors that had been written by a little girl, 9 years old, called Daisy Ashford. And I remember my parents being very impressed by this and me thinking, but nine's really old. I would be able to get a book published before that. So I must have been pretty young. Needless to say, I didn't actually manage this.
Hmm. Um, okay. Thank you. Would you consider yourself as a geek? Were you or are you part of the fandom community?
Yes, I'm a geek. Yes, good grief, yes. I'm a role player. I play tabletop and live action role playing and role playing games and free forms. I watch a lot of anime. Most of my tastes sort of lean geekward, and I've always been drawn to science fiction and fantasy. I go to lots of science fiction and fantasy conventions, so I know quite a lot of people in the wider SFF community. And my house is basically full of toys, games, and dressing up clothes. I've got things like this. I don't know how well you can see this.
Lightsaber. Yes, and I can also see steampunk goggles behind you.
Yes, yes, the background. I got very bored during lockdown, and I was on a lot of video calls, and I kept having this rather dull bookcase behind me. So, in a fit of boredom, I got a bit handicrafts and made myself a slightly shonky steampunk
Hmm.
submarine background.
Can a bookcase really be boring?
Well, it's just that everyone had bookcases, whereas I think
Mm.
I was the only person with a steampunk submarine.
Yeah, for sure. At least up until now. What are some of your fandoms? Because geeks are never geeks of everything, so there probably are your favorites.
I'm I'm actually pretty omnivorous. I am quite sort of dilettante, and also I am terribly prone to other people's contagious enthusiasms. So, if I find somebody who knows about something that I don't know about and is enthusiastic about them, I end up monopolizing them and asking them a ton of questions for ages, and then running off and looking into the thing myself. So, I am a sort of terribly unfaithful serial geek.
Yes. Now, know that this isn't a very original question. I'm sure that you've been asked this many times before, and yet I'm sure that my audience would love to know. Uh, what writers or specific works have inspired you? Um, if nothing else, then my audience is always on the lookout for a good reading list or something to watch.
Well, I strongly suspect that a lot of the books that have inspired me and shaped me most as a writer are the books that I read when I was young. So authors like Susan Cooper and Alan Garner, between them, gave me a strong sense of a mythic and got me interested in folklore. Nicholas Fisk was my introduction to science fiction. He is a supremely unpatronizing writer for children, and I quite liked that dark edge. Um, Leon Garfield got me into historical adventure fiction, and then there's a lot of classic writers like Lewis Carroll, Tolkien, Ursula Le Guin, as you might expect, Conan Doyle. That
Hmm.
he was my gateway to detective fiction, and writers like Catherine Storr. There's a book that I loved when I was about 8 or 9 called Marianne Dreams, which
Hmm.
spooked the dickens out of me, and I loved it.
Hmm. Can you mention perhaps a number of specific works that perhaps inspired you in the past or presently inspire you?
In terms of the books and series that really did shape my imagination when I was young, the Darkest Rising series by Susan Cooper, I nearly always end up mentioning. That was
Mhm.
read to me and my sister by my father, often next to a blazing fire, which is exactly the best way to have that series read to you. And so yes, I think that series has a lot to answer for.
Okay, cool. Um, Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about your work habits? Where do you write? When do you do it on a computer, or do you first write by hand? And have your habits changed over the years, or perhaps from book to book?
I usually write straight into a computer. And in fact, even my brainstorming documents are usually Word documents on the computer. And this is partly because my typing speed is actually a lot faster than my writing speed. Uh, if I'm making notes, though, I will quite often jot things down on paper. I'll make lists, I'll draw maps, and occasionally, if I'm trying to brainstorm the shape of a plot, I will cover my largest table with lots of post-it notes with oddments on it and little lines between them all. And it ends up looking like one of those boards in detective shows that the heroes put together when they're trying to work out where the next murder is going to happen. Um, and yes, there's an awful lot of moving those around and swearing at bits of paper. So I do a lot of that. In terms of discipline, there are a lot of people who contend quite rightly that it's a very good idea to try and have some kind of schedule and structure. And if possible, write the same number of words every day. And if you can do this, that's brilliant. I recommend doing it. I am rubbish at this. Um, my schedule varies wildly. My productivity varies wildly. In a day, I might produce something between 10 and 10,000 words. And I
Wow.
have to admit that my productivity tends to be a lot more intense if there's a deadline looming.
Hmm. And where do you write? Do you write at home, in cafes? Do you have a special table or anything, or just anywhere?
Quite often, I will write on my laptop at the kitchen table. I do also have this. This is my study, believe it or not, as well as being my submarine. So I can write up here as well, but often it's downstairs in the kitchen next to the tea, and it's quite quiet and there's no distractions. Um, I brainstorm quite often by going for a walk. I find that helps me untangle plot knots and work things through in my head. And just the motion of walking and being able to have the sort of external stimulus seems to help. I got I got the main idea for the light tree while I was on a long walk by the river. In fact, I believe the idea hit me when I was halfway across a bridge.
Awesome. Do you write alone? Do you write with company? Do you have a writing group?
I did the actual writing alone. Um, I have belonged to a number of small writing groups, usually with friends who are similarly interested in pushing forward their writing or who are already writers, and I find that really useful. But as I say, these tend to be small writers groups, so 2, 3, or 4, at most 5 people. I think I'd find a larger or more official group really quite intimidating, and I find it very useful. I mean, for one thing, as previously mentioned, I am often more productive when there's a deadline. So these writers' groups provide a sort of little mini deadline that serve as a very useful boot in the rear. but also you're getting feedback, not only on the things that aren't working, but the things that are, so you don't end up endlessly second guessing yourself.
Mhm.
And they help rein in some of my weaknesses, like my enthusiastic tendency to over-describe.
Mhm. Okay, although I must say I love your descriptions.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
as long as you don't reach the Tolkien level descriptions of 15 pages for a tree, I think you're good. Um,
All I can say is you don't see the first drafts. You see them after my friends and my editors have staged interventions and the machete has been applied.
mhm. You said that you've never not thought of becoming a writer, but still, being a full-time writer, or at least a professional writer, um, is not that simple. So I was thinking, what would you have been if you hadn't been a writer?
Well, at one point, I was a technical author and a graphic designer for a software company, though I was writing in my free time still and trying to get published. And I do rather think that whatever other job I got, I would have been writing in my free time and trying to get published. If I had to pick some other dream job, I suppose something involved a lot of travel and variety would be nice. I do thrive on variety or something else creative. But I
For
think I
example,
must have been trying to become a writer.
submarine captain.
Yes, yes, plenty of travel. Though you don't get so much of a view except through the periscope.
Yes. Okay. Um, so I think one of the biggest difficulties with the writing field today and with publishing is the rise of AI. So I was wondering if I can get your opinion about what do you think about the rise in prominence of AI in publishing, whether if it's writing, editing, etc., or even AI art.
Um, mm, I Not all my views are printable. Um,
Not
I
what?
think we're an amazing species and we create astonishing things. And AI is unquestionably an astonishing thing that could be put to an awful lot of uses, a lot really good uses, such as processing an awful lot of medical data, processing meteorological data, and tracking the change of the climate, that sort of thing. Um, but we also use it for other things that perhaps it is less well suited for, like establishing facts and writing fiction. It is not necessarily good at this. For one thing, it's fairly terrible as a research tool because it it doesn't know what a reliable source is. Granted, a lot of people don't apparently either, but at least people can learn. People can, whereas an AI cannot know because it cannot really know anything. Um, as for fiction, I am one of the people that regards the wholesale use of existing fiction to train AIs without the permission of the creators to be plagiarism. And while you can draw analogies between what an AI does and what a writer does in reading lots of other works and then using that to inspire them so that they can then produce their own work, it's not really the same because a writer will always bring something new, even if they're dealing with similar subject matter or uh, riffing on the same themes that others have used, they almost can't help but bring in their own personality, their own experiences, the quirks of their own time period, their own soul. And an AI can't. An AI actually doesn't have anything new to bring in that way. It's all it can actually do is steal other people's material, chew it to a kind of mulch, and then spit it out again. So you may gather I do not have the highest opinion of AI when it comes to production of fiction. Um, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Mm. I think you're pretty clear on
Sorry?
the subject. I think you're pretty clear on the subject. Okay, so let's move on. One of the things that really made me fall in love with your books is your writing voice. We talked about the descriptions, the imagery, the almost poetic descriptions. So I want to ask you, how did you develop this voice, and how do you make it work? Because today, literature, I mean, readers are not the same as readers of all, and they seem to be a little less patient for description. Uh, and if I may add a little small question, how do you even know if the descriptions work or not? Do you want me to
Well,
summarize the question?
well, first of all, thank you very much. Um, it's, I suspect my writing style has a lot to do with first the fact that even when I was very young, I was reading quite a lot, and therefore absorbing lots of different styles. And second, the fact that I am a complete word junkie. I just really enjoy playing around with language and trying different things and seeing what I can make it do. In fact, this is also my weakness because I get really carried away. And as previously mentioned, if I'm not careful, my descriptions sort of run away with themselves. Um, I have no trouble coming up with metaphors and similes. Those pop in my head perfectly naturally. What I have trouble with is stopping. I have trouble with restraint. So I think over time my style has changed a bit, but it has been less a matter of cultivating a lyrical style and more trying to rein it in a bit. And but obviously not completely. Um, do I always know whether it's working? No, not always. And sometimes you get a feel that something is right, and you get that sense even when you're writing it. Other times, well, that's another case where writers groups are very
Mhm.
useful. Um, I've been at least one writers group where one of the things we would do is we would get someone to read out the new piece that we're going to be discussing, but we wouldn't get the person who'd written it to read it out. And it's very interesting listening to somebody else read something that you've written and finding out where they stumble, where they instinctively put emphases in a sentence that you weren't expecting, or and so that find out how it reads to them. And sometimes that's been the point where I've been able to work out whether it's working or not. And sometimes the answer is no.
Mhm. Interesting. I've never thought about giving your work to someone else to read aloud. That's the idea. Interesting. And does it sometimes happen or happened in the past that you really love a description and you really don't want to get rid of it, but everyone tells you it's not working?
Yes. Oh, it happens all the time. Absolutely all the time. And and I tend to have little documents where I can move those pieces I cut out because I don't want to destroy them, and because I like them. And I tell myself I might use them in another book. They're just obviously not right for this book. But I move them to this other document where at least they're safe. They're with all their friends, these other little paragraphs that I've cut out. And it feels less brutal somehow.
And did you ever use something that you kept?
Occasionally. Um, but some of them never end up in a new book. Some of them just live out their hairy little paragraphy lives in this safe little document where I've left them.
Yes. I mean, perhaps, one day when you're hugely famous around the world, and maybe you'll publish the book with all the snippets that never got published.
I don't think I should do that.
But it would be
It's
interesting.
the same as
Okay.
people saying, "Oh no, you said that those things you wrote when you were a teenager. Oh, maybe you could get those published now." My answer is no, no. I was learning my craft then. No, those were handwritten, a lot of them. They are staying in my drawer where they belong.
Hmm. I mean, there are the books and notebooks by C.S. Lewis that he wrote for his brother, and they both wrote each other's stories, and those were the basis for the Chronicles of Narnia, and they got published, and those are fascinating.
Yes, uh, I am very aware of the limitations of the things I was producing. I wrote my first full-length-ish novel when I was 13, and it it involved a 13-year-old spy, and it had car chases, and I knew nothing about cars, and police procedural sort of elements, and I knew nothing about those, and guns, which I knew nothing about, and espionage equipment about which I knew nothing. And of course, I didn't have the internet. And it was very Hitchcock influenced. That's the best that can be said about it. I had a big thing for Hitchcock.
Yes, as did I when I was a child. Okay, so let's move on. In many of your books, there is a thread, stylistic and narrative connection to folk tradition and fairy tales. It changes from book to book sometimes, but there are always dark undertones. If this observation of mine rings true, I would love for you to elaborate on this. Why folk and fairy tales?
Yes, it is very true. Um, I do tend to find them really potent, and I think this was partly, uh, as I say, Susan Cooper and Alan Garner giving me this sense of the folkloric and the mythic, and so it's their fault. They got me hooked. Um, but yes, I do like old folk tales, old fairy tales, particularly the older, darker ones, because those are the tales where everything's rather larger than life, and where the monstrous parts of our psyche come out to dance in the moonlight. So all the forbidden desires, the ugly resentments, the twisted wishes, the deeper and primal and less acceptable fears, they're all there, coming out and manifesting in odd shapes. And I like the odd dream logic they have, this sense of emotional rightness to a lot of the events. So yes, I find them very interesting to draw upon. Um, I also like the fact that a lot of them are tied to place. So
Mhm.
I never really feel like I know a place until I understand its stories, and that partly means the historical anecdotes connected to it, but it also means it's folklore. It's weird stories.
Hmm. I think especially in Cuckoo Song, where you sort of create your own version of fairies, you also touch on various folklore sounding myths or so. Uh, I would love to know perhaps what in folklore inspired you in Cuckoo Song.
Certainly. Um, okay, so for anybody who hasn't read it, what I'm about to say is going to be a bit of a spoiler. So if you don't want the spoiler, skip ahead in this video. Right, for anyone who's still listening, Cuckoo's Song is a changeling story. Uh, I've always had well, certainly younger me had an irrational fear of doubles, basically people or things that look like people they're not. And I used to find this idea completely terrifying. And I used to have nightmares about suddenly realizing that someone close to me was not in fact them, as I noticed the real them across the park or something like that. And yes, I always found this just deeply frightening. So the idea of the changeling has always had quite a potent place in my imagination. This very old idea that somebody, usually a child, quite often a baby, is stolen by the fairies, the trolls, the fauns, whatever happens to be the local non-human race living in the wild. And something is left in the child's place that almost looks like them and almost acts like them, but isn't them. And sometimes it's actually an adult creature pretending to be a young being, a baby. Sometimes it's actually a young version of these beings that's been left. It's a baby switch. And sometimes it's a model made of wax or leaves or sticks, and it's not made to last. And so I was really intrigued by these stories. I thought I liked the idea of writing a changeling story. And so I started reading the old folk tales. And they were absolutely chilling and not in the way I expected.
Can you give example for like one fairy tale?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, well, a lot of them follow the same sort of pattern, and there will often be a case of a baby or a child that is not behaving the way it was before. It screams continually. It seems uglier and more ill-tempered than before, and it eats. Changelings are often ravenously hungry. It eats and eats. And the parents are run ragged. And then somebody from outside the house, and it's surprisingly often a traveling tailor, takes a look at it and says, that's not your baby. That's a changeling. And here's where it gets dark, or rather darker, because the standard recommendation from these kindly advisors is that the way you deal with the changeling is cruelty. So you have these changeling children, many of which are babies, or at least look like babies, being beaten with sticks, or left on a dung heap to scream, or thrown into the mill race, or onto the fire. And I read all this and I started to feel sorry for the changeling, which I wasn't expecting. And that's when my idea about how I was going to write this changeling story completely changed. And I started to wonder, what if you have the changeling child who doesn't know what she is, who knows something's very wrong, whose memories are patchy, and who's aware that something's wrong, something seems to be wrong with her, but who is a mixture of the types of change I mentioned before. She is alive, she is aware, but she is a doll, and she's not built to last, and she's potentially in terrible trouble if other people work out what she is.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But you're not talking about like the Grimm fairy tales.
Sorry?
You're not talking about the Grimm fairy tales. You're talking about other fairy tale traditions.
Yes, yeah, indeed. There was a collection I found. I can't remember the name of the editor who collected them, but it was specifically older changeling folk tales. And in fact, I borrowed one or two elements from specific changeling folk tales.
Okay, but you don't have to reveal. You don't have to
Sorry?
reveal your secrets if you don't want to.
Okay, I won't say what they are because I think I've already revealed quite a lot about the book. But yes, some odd little details that occur regarding the protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say something involving eggs and something involving a cockerel
Yes.
are taken
Um,
from actual legends.
okay. So moving on, although somewhat related to my previous question, your books, or at least the ones I've read, have a certain balance between happiness, wonder, and hope on the one hand, and a sense of the uncanny and the macabre on the other hand. Death, dark, supernatural, um, whether it's a tree that feeds on lies, ghosts, sea monsters, etc. All of these are sort of never really far away. Um, so what I would love to ask you is, what do you think is the attractions readers, perhaps everyone has to these dark elements?
Well, it's certainly an attraction, I feel. I've always loved dark stories. I've always loved ghost stories, thrillers, um, horror stories. And even when I was very young, as I say, one of my favorite books was Marianne Dreams, which I found very scary and absolutely loved. Um, I think dark fantasy in particular, it allows you to move into some sort of odd hinterlands of the mind, and going into that territory is actually quite cathartic and freeing. And as you say, I am also, my books do tend to have elements of hope in them, and I think that's probably because I'm quite a hopeful person. I think I am naturally an optimist. So the dark fantasy does, it gives you an opportunity to actually give shape and name to the monsters of your mind and your life, and by doing so face them. You can take stories on what is a an exciting but unnerving journey into the darker forests of the psyche, but at the same time show that there are paths out again, if that makes any sense.
Yes, actually, I think it makes perfect sense. Thank you. So maybe to veer off from these dark things, I want to know because I visited your website, your official website, many times, and I found that there was this sort of game in your website. So I really wanted to know, which, by the way, I finished the game, I made it. Who came up with the real game in your website? And do you have any idea how many people play it, how many people finished it? Do fans refer to it at times?
Um, I came up with the actual game. I came up with the story and the riddles and all the rest of it. It was put in place by my webmaster, um, so credit to him, and all the lovely artwork that fits alongside and gives flavour to the different locations in the Twisted City. That was created by an artist called Antonia Russell Clark, and as you can see, she's done a brilliant job. Now, I had a I had a lot of fun coming up with that. I don't know how many people play it, but some people clearly do, because occasionally I get messages through the contact form on my website saying, "I'm stuck on this puzzle. Can you give me the answer?" I never do. Uh, I'm also aware that sometimes um, teachers will clearly have directed uh, their students towards my website, presumably because they're looking at one of my books in class. And then I'll get a lot of little messages responding, well, asking questions about the puzzles, or commenting on it, which is rather nice actually.
Yes, I think it's one of the first, if not the first, sort of online escape room that I've encountered. So kudos on that. I think it's a shame that you don't have information about how many people play it and how many people finish it, etc. Um, okay. So going back to your books, the plots of your books tend to occur in very specific but different historical times. Um, could you tell us your thoughts about writing in time? I know that it's an unusual question, but I don't want to ask you just why you choose to sort of temporally position your books when you did. I mean, you've answered these questions before, uh, and still, how shall I put it? Just simply your thoughts about your books and time.
It's true. Three of my books are set in specific real world historical periods, and the others have a sort of historical flavour to them, even the ones that are set in alternative worlds. Um, and obviously, as previously mentioned, I enjoy historical settings. I have fun researching them. I like historical adventures, but in terms of my relationship with time, I think to some extent I regard change as both inevitable and necessary. I am not the sort of person who writes stories that start with a happy status quo that then gets disrupted, but then this is fixed and we go back to the happy status quo. My initial status quos are not happy, and in fact, stasis itself is never a good sign. Stagnation is a sign that things have gone wrong. So in my books, there is always nothing goes back to the way it was. People and things and the world all change dramatically, and I always like to create a sense at the end of the book that they'll continue changing. That is not the end. That is not the final statement. In a way, my stories are more about unlocking potential than completely resolving it.
That's actually makes me think about the ending of your books, which I've read a little differently. But also, if I may make two observations, oftentimes, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine the plot of the book happening in any other time than the one in which it takes place. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be that you have a sort of appeal to bygone eras, to stuff in the past.
Yes, I do. I mean, basically, the past is a gigantic treasure chest full of fun and fascinating and weird facts and dystopias that provably existed and extraordinary people and unbelievable events. So, also, I like the fact that writing in a historical or mock historical setting gives me a bit more freedom. For one thing, I am writing with young protagonists. If I'm using a contemporary setting, well, responsible parenting does get in the way of all the adventure. Whereas in the past, it's perfectly reasonable that they might be working in a dangerous environment. It's not implausible that they'll find themselves thrown back on their own devices. It's a lot easier to imperil my protagonists.
In the past, in history.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Yes, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's plenty of peril in the modern day, but I guess history, like fantasy, gives us a bit of distance. It's a useful lens through which we can actually talk about things that matter, but through a lens that makes it a little easier.
Yes, and also perhaps because children in the past were freer to experience things, were not as well kept and closed off as children in the past.
Absolutely. Loving parents would basically kick the children out of the house and say, "Come back at tea time." And the children just run off and have adventures for a few hours and then come back. In a way that simply wouldn't happen then. Absolutely. There was notions of responsible parenting have changed a lot. Children absolutely did have more freedom and often more responsibility. And yes, so it does as a writer, it does give me a little more leeway there.
Okay, cool. Now this is a question that I've really been waiting to ask you. Your books, they clearly require a great deal of research, which I'm sure that you do because it shows. Could you tell us about your process? How long does it take you to research a book? How do you know when research is done? because, there's always the temptation to go on and on researching. And finally, how do you know what to put in and what not to?
As previously mentioned, I really enjoy research. It's like treasure hunting. You get to sort through a lot of material looking for the fascinating, the funny, the weird, the bizarre, the macabre, and yes, I really enjoy it. This does mean that I do have to. um, I often do rather too much. There's there's usually a few months of research before I even start writing, but then the research continues in parallel, and I can get a little obsessive. I definitely remember at one point when when I was writing A Skinful of Shadows, which is set during the early stages of the English Civil War. I was doing a lot of research because with the historical fantasy, where it's actually set in a real period, there is a very real danger that other people will know my setting better than I do. So I didn't want to get the historical details wrong if I could help it. And I remember at one point trying to find out where some quarantine huts, which I knew existed, were located outside the walls of Oxford, so that I knew which gate my heroine would be led out through, so that I knew when she ran away how many rivers she'd have to cross as she was heading to Islip. And I spent ages trying to search for maps and accounts, and I lost about a day before thinking, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Literally nobody cares. I didn't even need to mention how many rivers she's crossing. What am I doing? And you can absolutely fall into these rabbit holes. And sometimes you need to slap yourself a little bit and then climb out again. But yes, I tend to read up a lot. I also sometimes engage in practical research, which is quite fun. I have scrambled around on active volcanoes for research. I've gone on a one-day cheese-making course for research. I have been down into underground areas, blackwater rafting, or going through buried rooms and buildings in places like Seattle and Edinburgh, and caves and tunnels for research. And I rather enjoy all of that. It does also mean that I am possibly the only person who has claimed volcanoes against tax.
Yes, I mean, what are you doing in space, Francis? Oh, research. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Um, okay. Another question. In a world practically inundated with trilogies, book series who don't seem to end without naming any names, why are most of your books standalones?
There are a number of reasons for that. One reason is that I actually quite like writing self-contained stories. And in fact, even the only sequel I've written is something that I deliberately wrote to be relatively self-contained, so you could kind of pick up what was going on, even if you hadn't read the first one. A second reason is that I have a somewhat turbulent love-hate relationship with my books, in that I start by loving them, and the further I get on with them, the more I hate them and become convinced that it was a terrible idea to write them, and that everyone else will hate them too, and that they'll line up outside my house and throw rocks at me. This has not happened yet, but that sooner or later they'll find out where I live. This does mean that by the time I finish a book, the last thing I want to do is write another one exactly like it. I want to do something completely different. And the third reason is that I really enjoy world building. So
Mhm.
I could reuse a world I've created, but I could alternatively just throw it away and have fun building a new one. So I
Mhm.
usually do that.
But I
Besides,
mean, going back to the world of the light tree, going back to the world of Skin Full of Shadows, uh, each one of these deep light, each one of these is like a world in and of itself, which sort of begs going back to.
I'd have to think of a separate story that I really wanted to write that that had to be in that world. Um, that is another thing. Quite often, when I'm writing my book, I am unspooling some of the secrets of that world. And once I've done that, some of the mystery's gone. Um,
Mhm.
so I'd need more. I'd need other things to be discovered, other changes to be made. So unless I thought of something in particular that had to draw me back to one of those worlds, then most of them I will probably leave as they are.
So aren't you pressured, I don't know, by readers or editors or publishers? Well, this work, well, do more there. No?
Um, generally speaking, not. My publishers are very good about letting me write my very strange books in the very strange way that I seem to want to, and are generally speaking broad-minded and accommodating. So I've been pretty lucky there.
Mhm. Does it happen to you that perhaps you think, well, this might be a good idea, but it'd be way too difficult to write about this, uh, so I'd rather not? Or do you see just a challenge and you go,
Um,
gung ho?
I'm very much the latter. I always feel that my books should scare me a bit in one way or another, and so I am much more likely to say, "Wow, I wonder if I could get this to work," and and be some way into it while thinking, "I'm not sure I'm succeeding at this, but I am now committed."
Yes, I mean, it seems that you don't give yourself any discounts with regards to your ideas and the work that they require. Um, okay, then perhaps just one more question, which again I have to ask, and I hope that you can tell me. If you can't, fair enough. Is there any chance that we will see a movie about one or more of your books? Is it something that you think or dream about?
Um, it would be lovely. I think there are probably very few writers who would not love to see their books made into a TV show or a film or something like that. A number of my books have been optioned over the years. As yet, it's never got beyond that stage. I mean, there was one point where something got greenlit, but then didn't come to anything. Um, and the fact is, with these things, even if it's optioned 99 point whatever percent of the time, it's not going to come to anything. So there isn't really much point in dreaming about it or, casting the book in my head or anything like that. And in fact, my general approach, if if a book is optioned, is to regard this as some very nice people coming and giving me money for no good reason.
Hmm.
And if you just regard it that way, then it sort of takes the sting out of it, and you don't get disappointed.
Yes. And perhaps one teeny last question, if I may. I always like to end my interviews with a question, if perhaps you have any tips for aspiring writers who are inspired by your writing.
Well, my usual advice is be stubborn. Um, I would be lying if I said that luck was not a factor in this business, but the best way to be lucky is to keep rolling the dice. Um, read widely, read stuff that is not your sort of thing, because the more voices you're absorbing, the better your chance of truly finding your own voice. Get feedback from people you trust. Listen to the feedback. Um, almost everything is improved by cutting.
Hmm.
And don't be afraid to send your work off. You have literally nothing to lose. Um, I remember I remember this feeling of terror when I first started sending off my work at the age of about 16, because I think in my head I was convinced that some editor somewhere would read my work, and then they would go to editor headquarters and open the big black tome of authors we will never publish because they sent us that story that one time and write my name in it. This tome does not exist. It's all okay. Oh yes, and one of the best pieces of advice I got given by somebody else was treat your rejections as trophies. The more of them you have, the more evidence you have that you are taking your craft seriously. All the best people have a ton of rejection letters. It just means you're joining a very large club.
Okay. So Frances, thank you very much for this interview. It was a pleasure. And here's hoping to read many more of your wonderful books.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me.